شكرا.
Thank you, Madam President. I had wanted to welcome the presence of His Excellency the Secretary General with us, but he has now left us, so I'm going to move directly to my statement. Madam President, since the beginning of the crisis, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic was keen to improve the humanitarian situation of its people, and therefore, based on its constitutional and international obligations, it has continued to work day and night in order to fulfill all the humanitarian needs of its citizens. The Syrian government, in parallel to that, has also worked to restore peace and stability to the entire country. The Syrian government is fully committed and fully abides by international commitments, including its commitment to cooperate with the United Nations and its organizations in the humanitarian field, according to General Assembly Resolution 46/182 and the guidelines instituted by that resolution, in primary among which is respect for the national sovereignty of states. Accordingly, and in the context of the Syrian government implementing the presidential statement of October 2nd, 2013, the Syrian government has carried out a number of administrative and logistic measures which enable the United Nations and humanitarian organizations to expand their activities and increase their effectiveness. This would not have been possible had it not been for the cooperation of the Syrian government and the measures it has taken to facilitate that as a full partner. And here I mention, for example, only the agreement of the Syrian government to open a third air bridge to carry humanitarian assistance from the Iraqi city of Erbil to the Syrian city of Qamishli. This air bridge included 11 flights, whereas the first air bridge included 13 flights and the second one included 10 flights. The Syrian government has also offered to use its own air fleet in carrying out these flights as a goodwill measure. In addition to this partnership I just mentioned, I would like to remind you of the fact that the Syrian government bears the largest share of the humanitarian assistance distributed in Syria. It has covered 75% of this assistance, whereas UN organizations and other international organizations operating in Syria have covered only 25% of the total amount of assistance distributed. Madam President, some governments, some of which are members in this esteemed council, have insisted on responding to the Syrian openness, cooperation, and positive commitment in the humanitarian field. They have insisted on continuing and maintaining their deceptive campaign of raising doubts and spreading crude claims, which has unveiled and revealed very clearly the fact that some of them have bad intentions in principle against Syria. This has also revealed that some of them have sadistic intentions they want to reveal in international relations at the expense of the pain and suffering and the hopes of the Syrian nation. Some states have exposed their deep frustration against the emergence of positive developments in the humanitarian or political fields, and this frustration was reflected in destruction and terrorism, the price of which was paid by the Syrian government and continues to be paid by them. This was accompanied by a campaign of releasing escalating and provocative statements and holding inflammatory meetings with the encouragement and provocation clearly and crudely to armed terrorist groups which follow the commands of some member states that sponsor them and provide them with training in order to prevent the Syrian citizen from reaching his daily food and his livelihood, and which leave this Syrian citizen to sink in suffering, as my dear colleague from Argentina said. Madam President, some members of this council have reduced the complicated Syrian scene, complicated with Arab regional and international interventions, the fact that they have reduced this scene to a politicized humanitarian dimension alone deepens the humanitarian crisis and traffics in the suffering of the Syrian citizen. It is also a biased and subjective reading which covers the masking of the grave interventionist dimensions and which pushes towards manipulating the humanitarian crisis and misleading international public opinion. And here suffice it to say that some members of this council have objected 8 times to having this council adopt even press statements denouncing terrorist acts that have taken the lives of thousands of Syrian innocent civilians. These same states who are so very eager to discuss the humanitarian situation in Syria in this council have also refused providing ambulances and wheelchairs for people with special needs. Madam President, the Syrian government has long welcomed all sincere efforts in order to help improve the humanitarian situation in Syria and has cooperated positively with the United Nations. We have also welcomed the presidential statement of the Security Council in October 2012 and abided by its provisions. Supporting Syrians in the humanitarian field, ladies and gentlemen, cannot be carried out effectively and truly unless it is also accompanied in word and deed with a non-politicization of humanitarian topics and putting an end to terrorism. The activities of the armed terrorist groups, including those associated with Al-Qaeda, are the main reason for the humanitarian suffering of the Syrian people. These armed terrorist groups are targeting in a systematic way the destruction of the infrastructure and the destruction and bleeding of the resources of the country, in addition to premeditated intentional targeting of humanitarian convoys and plundering them repeatedly and systematically, as well as attacks against humanitarian workers, killing several of them, in addition to attacks and blockades against a number of Syrian areas, preventing the civilians in them from reaching any humanitarian assistance for a long time. The use of these civilians as humanitarian hostages and human shields in order to prevent the Syrian security forces and army from moving against terrorism. In this context, the Syrian government, like all other states, which are members of this international organization, is carrying out its right and its constitutional right and duty to combat this terrorism which attacks Syria without discrimination, and it's doing that based on international law and the resolutions of your esteemed council. Law enforcement, ladies and gentlemen, is in the heart of state authority, including combating and confronting terrorist activities carried out on our own territory, and nobody can deny the duty of the state and its exclusive right to do so. Madam President, in addition to the terrorist activities I just mentioned, it is well known that the effects of the coercive unilateral economic measures imposed by certain states illegitimately against the Syrian people have led to negative effects on the livelihood and living conditions of the Syrians, in addition to another obstacle, which is lack of humanitarian financing. The financing of the humanitarian response plan for 2014 is not exceeded 7% of the required funding, in spite of the show conferences held here and there, whereas the amount of financing for the regional response plan for Syrian refugees has not exceeded 13% only. Madam President, the Syrian government has announced early on that it is serious and sincere in seeking to resolve the crisis through a political process built on dialogue with all political forces and civil, cultural, and economic constituencies in the country, including the national opposition and the armed personnel who would lay aside their weapons and give priority to the language of reason and law in order to preserve the country and maintain its institutions. The government in this context has provided true judicial, security, and political guarantees for those who want to be involved in this national process. And indeed, this government approach has led to concrete results on the ground in a number of Syrian regions. Recently, a number of reconciliation processes, local conciliation processes, have been carried out and have sent a clear message to the world that the children of Syria are capable of resolving their crisis by themselves in isolation of any outside manipulation of their interests. What we have heard just now from a colleague, that the security forces have arrested some Syrians who have surrendered themselves within the conciliation process, is entirely untrue, and I am here denying it in front of all of you. In this context, the government is working around the clock to make sure that all service facilities in those areas will be ready to provide for the needs of the residents and to receive the remaining displaced people who are willing to return to their homes to live in peace and stability. In the end, the homeland is the final refuge for its children, especially if we take into consideration the fact that the suffering of Syrian refugees has become a commodity for cheap political trafficking, in addition to the suffering of Syrian refugee camps in terms of deteriorating health, living, and security conditions and unethical indignities laid against the Syrians living in these camps. Madam President, the Syrian government has abided by all the content of the presidential statement issued by the Security Council on October 2nd, 2013. I have myself welcomed after that, a few minutes after that presidential statement came out, I welcomed it. Many of the provisions of that statement are repeated in the resolution just adopted in this council. This resolution, which in turn has clearly emphasized the fact and unequivocally emphasized the fact that there is international terrorism carried out by some groups associated with Al-Qaeda after unjustified and incomprehensible denial of the presence and existence of that terrorism throughout the Syrian crisis. The time has come for the Council to carry out seriously and firmly its duties in terms of dealing with the roots of the humanitarian situation, namely the terrorist activities carried out by religious Takfiri groups against civilians in Syria with the support of well-known governments, individuals, and entities. This is a support in which also the occupation Israeli forces are cooperating publicly and openly in the forced separation zone in the occupied Syrian Golan. Carrying out and delivering humanitarian assistance across borders can never be done in a manner that violates national Syrian sovereignty as guaranteed by the UN Charter. And here we caution and warn against exceeding the provisions of the General Assembly Resolution 46/182 and the provisions of the guidelines for providing humanitarian assistance, creating the impression that merely allowing humanitarian operations to go on across borders with governments and states that are involved in escalating humanitarian crisis and with support of the Daesh and al-Nusra and the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, the mere impression that allowing humanitarian operations across the borders in cooperation with governments involved in escalating this process, the impression that this would resolve the humanitarian crisis of millions of Syrians is nothing more than an ironic emulation of the children's story of the magic wand that would resolve all problems. Because these neighboring states are the ones that are bringing terrorism to Syria and shedding the blood of Syrian citizens. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, violence has reached, as my dear colleague, the ambassador of Nigeria, has reached almost the absurd and the illogical and surreal. This is true. But the question remains, why is this happening in Syria? And why is this unjustified silence towards all forms of crude external intervention in the Syrian matter? The prevailing mentality among some, unfortunately, is a mentality of the diplomacy of hyenas and not diplomacy of international humanitarian law. One final remark, Madam President. A colleague said that the government delegation in Geneva rejected the proposed solution offered by Mr. Ibrahimi. I am here to deny that because I was there in the room and I approved that proposal a minute after it was presented. The party that rejected the draft agenda was the other party. It was the other party which rejected the draft agenda, and you can ask the international mediator, Mr. Lakhdar Ibrahimi, when he meets with you soon, about the details of that story. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic for his statement.
To General Assembly Resolution 46/182 and the guidelines instituted by that resolution, in primary among which is respect for the national sovereignty of states. Accordingly, and in the context of the Syrian government implementing the presidential statement of October 2nd, 2013, the Syrian government has carried out a number of administrative and logistic measures which enable the United Nations and humanitarian organizations to expand their activities and increase, and therefore, based on its constitutional and international obligations, it has continued to work day and night in order to fulfill all the humanitarian needs of its citizens. The Syrian government, in parallel to that, has also worked to restore peace and stability to the entire country. The Syrian government is fully committed and fully abides by international commitments, including its commitment to cooperate with the United Nations and its organizations in the humanitarian field, according.
شكرا.
Thank you, Madam President. I had wanted to welcome the President of His Excellency the Secretary General with us, but he has now left us, so I'm going to move directly to my statement. Madam President, since the beginning of the crisis, the government of the Syrian Arab Republic was keen to improve the humanitarian situation of its people, included 10 flights. The Syrian government has also offered to use its own air fleet in carrying out these flights as a goodwill measure. In addition to this partnership I just mentioned, I would like to remind you of the fact that the Syrian government bears the largest share of the humanitarian assistance distributed in Syria. It has covered 75% of this assistance, whereas their effectiveness. This would not have been possible had it not been for the cooperation of the Syrian government and the measures it has taken to facilitate that as a full partner. And here I mention, for example, only the agreement of the Syrian government to open a third air bridge to carry humanitarian assistance from the Iraqi city of Erbil to the Syrian city of Qamishli. This air bridge included 11 flights, whereas the first air bridge included 13 flights and the second one